Greetings, viewers. The sound of the ding means the show started. How are you? I'm Eric the Car Guy, and we do this show every other week, every other Wednesday, 7 p.m., where I answer your automotive questions and sometimes butcher your names. I apologize for that in advance. But the important part is we try to answer your automotive questions, which brings me to where I get these automotive questions from. Where I take these automotive questions from is the Google Plus page or posting for this event. So that's if you want your question answered, that's where you post it. I cannot see the questions that are posted to the YouTube video, and I will not be answering those as a result. Apologize for that in advance. Also, questions that are posted after the event has concluded will also not be answered. So apologize for that as well. So you're thinking, well, Eric, well, what good are you? I agree. So for those questions that happen outside of these events, things like that, what I ask you to do is head over to EricTheCarGuy.com. There's a welcome video there to tell you about all of our amazing stuff to help you with automotive issues, should you have them. It's there 24/7, 365. So that's where you go if you have questions, and we're not covering it in this live show. Given that last time I sort of got caught up in some of the questions that I was answering, I'm going to try to go a little bit quicker in this episode so that we can do this. Oh, and by the way, the next show will be October 22nd for those of you that don't get questions answered in this show. And I'm just going to go, the first guy that posted a question, early bird gets the worm, as they say, Tim B. Hi, Eric. What could make a temp gauge jump from low to mid-range back and forth quickly? It does not overheat. I've changed the thermostat, temp sensor, fan clutch, flush radiator, and burped the system. This happens around 4 to 5 times in a 20-mile span, doing 55 to 60 miles per hour. It's also happened at lower speeds. This is a 1994 Ford Ranger with a 4-liter. Thanks for any input. Even though you say you've burped the system, that's the first place I would look. Anytime you got fluctuating temperature, things like that, that's usually what it indicates, because an air pocket will pass past the sensor, and that will be at a different temperature range than when the coolant goes through it. So if you've got, like, sort of, just think of like coolant air passing past a sensor, that could make the sensor do that. Now, let's say you did bleed it properly. And when I say bleeding it properly, put the heat all the way on high, turn the blower fan off for the heat. Because you want the coolant to circulate through the heater core, because that's oftentimes where the coolant gets trapped. Run the engine at about 2,500 RPM. In your case, you don't have an electric fan, so usually I wait till the electric fan comes on. But with a clutch fan, I usually run it, a good 3-4 minutes at that RPM, and then let off. I make sure it's up to temperature, and then I just sort of check to see if there's still air that's coming out. Now, you'll notice probably a lot of small bubbles that happen during this time. That's because the water, when it hits the atmosphere, will start to boil. So little bitty tiny bubbles, not so much what you're looking for. You're looking for those larger, like burpy kind of bubbles coming out. I use a spill-free funnel to do this with. It makes it easy. You don't necessarily have to have that. You can put a catch pan underneath the radiator, not fill it up all the way when you do this procedure. And then when you're done, you can top everything off and do it like that. But that's how I normally do it, and that's where I would go first. Also, there could be a wiring issue or an issue with the sensor. That's a possibility. But given that it only happens at certain speeds, and it doesn't happen all the time, I'm reluctant to think it's an electrical problem. The first place I would go with that is bleeding the air out of the cooling system. I'll post a link in the description to a video that I did about bleeding the air out of a cooling system, or burping a cooling system, if you will, along with a link for that spill-free funnel. In fact, for the rest of you, I will post links in the description for many, many things. So if you do have questions, I will also post links to articles that might help you for other questions that you might have. So check the description when all's said and done. Now I'm just going to spin the wheel and break the deal. All right. Bruce Austin. Hi, Eric. I love the channel. Thank you. 2007 BMW 530i that's having issues with maintaining consistent RPMs at idle and under load. It seems to jump up and down around 200 to 300 RPM all the time, even with the cruise control on. It only has 60,000 miles on it and had the throttle body and MAF cleaned, MAF being mass airflow sensor. And Air filter is also clean. I am also getting about 17 miles per gallon combined driving. I'm sure this issue is affecting it. It's not throwing any codes, but the dealer said it may be something like the secondary air intake. What is this, and could it be the issue? It is a straight 6 and only has one air intake as far as I know. Thanks. What they may be referring to there, and I think I've seen this issue come up in the past on BMWs, the straight 6 that you're talking about, is the intake on that vehicle, I believe, is 2 stages. And what I mean when I say that is I've actually done a video about this. Once again, I'll post a link in the description. With intake runners, long, narrow runners, so a long, narrow intake tube leading down into the cylinder head to the intake valve is good for low-end torque. However, it compromises high-end horsepower. So the faster you go, or the faster the engine revs, it starts to be choked off, because all of a sudden, you know, that long, narrow runner that was really working to help increase the velocity of the air coming in is no longer working in its favor. It needs to open up. So many times what they do is a 2-stage intake. So they might have a baffle or a series of butterflies or something like that inside of an intake manifold to take advantage of those 2 principles. So long, narrow runners being good for low-end torque, but a big open plenum is good for high RPM engine power. So to walk the line between those 2 things, what companies often do is they have 2 stages inside the existing intake. So it may look like you have one intake, but internally inside that intake, there could be a set of butterflies, baffles, whatever, that open up at that higher RPM. Now, what I've heard of on those, if I'm not mistaken, is something about the valve that controls that opens and closes those butterflies, and also something else with the auto control valve. I also believe there's plastic. There's a lot of plastics there that also might be an issue, because what you're describing sounds like a vacuum leak. But the fact that there's no codes and everything like that, it could mean that it's an airflow problem, and it could be the results of what I just mentioned with that 2-stage intake not opening up like it's supposed to. It could be an involved job. It could involve like removing the intake, I think, and replacing some of those parts on the inside, but that's where I'd be directing my search, and even the dealership alluded to that. So you may be dealing with something or a valve that controls that. I wish I could take you further with it, but that's my thought on that. Okay, moving on. We have, actually I saw your question earlier and it's split up into 2 parts, but I'm actually going to start with the first part of this question because it's actually a decent question. This is Alistair Haddon. Yeah, Alistair Haddon. Hi Eric, today my friend's 2007 Honda Odyssey alternator died. The Honda dealership said that I should charge the battery. I told them that I measured the output voltage from the alternator, which read between 10 and 12 volts instead of 14.4. The guy at Honda said that a bad battery will draw extra voltage from the alternator, causing lower output voltage. Is this true? I have a hard time believing that. Anyway, I have charged the battery and still have a battery discharge light on the dash, and my output voltage of the alternator is still 10 to 12 volts. I removed the alternator and I'm getting it bench checked tomorrow at the alternator shop. FYI, Odysseys of this generation have a iVTEC VCM and a VTEC engine, non-VCM, and the alternator part numbers are different, just in case you haven't come across that scenario yet. I am surprised to see an alternator fail after only 7 years. Okay, to answer your question, as far as a bad battery causing an alternator problem, absolutely yes. The electrical system of the vehicle starts and ends at the battery. Everything starts and ends at the battery. If you have a weak battery, if you have bad connections, if you have corrosion at the terminals, if you have those junky cheap terminals that you replace the OE terminals with, hate them. If you have that stuff, then yes, absolutely, that can affect the output voltage of the entire electrical system. Because as I said, the battery is where it starts and ends. The battery is the alpha and omega. Any time you have an electrical issue, especially a charging issue like this, the very first thing to do is go to the battery, load test it, and make sure that it's putting out correctly. Now, a static charge, if you don't have the ability to load test a battery and you just want to know what kind of shape the battery's in, static charge on a battery should be 12.6 or above. So if you check the battery voltage and it's like 10 volts or something like that, there's a good chance that battery isn't good. So you should charge it up and then recheck it, give it a little bit. There's things about removing surface charges, that type of thing. But there are some really nice battery testers out there that a lot of auto parts stores have that, get really down into the minutia. They'd like count all the electrons inside the battery and tell you whether it's good or not. Those are actually quite good. Not that carbon pile load testers don't do the job. I've done videos on all of this. But to answer your question, and this is why I'm answering this, because what he did later in another statement that he made was he replaced the alternator and everything is good, but also I believe replaced or charged the battery in addition to that, and everything is right with the world now. But to your question about, can the battery cause an issue with the charging system? Absolutely. The battery can cause, especially on vehicles with a lot of electrical systems like an Odyssey like that's got, maybe navigation, those power doors, and all the other electrical doodads are all affected by low voltage. And if the battery has low voltage, the alternator tries to keep up. You can burn up an alternator this way. So in fact, you were asking about an alternator going bad after 7 years. If you're running it low with a battery, then yes, the alternator is working harder and will wear out faster. So just throwing that out there to answer your question. But the electrical system of the vehicle starts and ends with the battery. So anytime you have electrical problems, go to the battery first, make sure it's good, make sure the connections are clean, tight, and good. In fact, you can do voltage drops on them. I'll also post a video that I did on doing that if you expect a problem. So bad batteries don't just cause no starts, they cause all kinds of issues on especially modern vehicles with tons of electronics. Let's go to somebody that just asked a question. Javier Rodales. I think I got that right. Hey, man. Eric, I have a 2001 Ford Expedition with an electrical issue. Hey, interior lighting does not activate when I open any of the doors, not even the running boards. But when I turn them on with the respective switches, I already checked the fuses and they're all okay. I did not know how to check the relays, so I didn't check them. I know there is power flowing to the circuit because they work with the respective switches. Would you please give me some helpful information about what could be wrong? I really appreciate useful information. Thank you, Javier. Well, I did a video similar to this on my 1997 Subaru Legacy. And the issue on the Legacy was the door switches. And many times if a door switch goes bad, because when you open up the door, the circuit has to close in order for the dome lights and the interior lights to activate. So if there's a problem, sometimes, and with something like an Expedition, there's probably some modules and things involved that get an input from these switches. So with my Legacy, if you open the driver's door, you wouldn't see anything. In fact, there were also door indicators on the dash to tell you if a door was ajar. And that was a real easy way to narrow down that mine was the door switch. But you apparently open every door and you get nothing. So this leads me to believe this could be a communication issue. Maybe a communication issue between a switch and a control module, or maybe a control module problem, something like that. With the 2001, they started putting these electrical modules in for just about everything, and they communicate with each other over, I don't necessarily want to call them Ethernet cables, but they're like CAN or BCAN systems, or I don't want to get into a lengthy explanation about that, but they have like single wires that they talk to each other digitally with. And if there's an issue with communication between one module and another, you could get a situation like your dome light's not turning on. Now, some scan tools have the ability to pull codes for these body control modules or different control modules like this. Usually they're a little more expensive type of scan tool rather than your run-of-the-mill just pull check engine light kind of scan tools. So what I would advise you do in this situation is two things, actually. Seek out a manual for this vehicle to find out how the circuit is supposed to work, because that's going to be your best indication of what to look for. So if there is a relay involved, there may not be relays in this instance. It may be, like I said, these control modules that do all the switching for you. But they need to get an input from somewhere, and they need to do an output from somewhere, and then there's an action that happens. The lights go on when you open the door. And given that none of those lights are coming on, it's not getting a signal, or it's not sending a signal, or something like that. And the first place that I would start looking is for a communication error, and that may set a code. Also, on some of those higher end scan tools, you can actually go in and do the activation of these systems, so you can test them while you're sitting right there. And that may be something you have to take somewhere to somebody that has that type of scan tool that has those capabilities. So that would be part two. So the first thing is figure out how the circuit works. Second thing is see if you can find somebody or maybe even pay for just the diagnostics. You don't necessarily have to pay for the repair, but you can pay a diagnostic fee and say, hey, can you pull any codes from my body control module that could possibly give me an idea of what's going on with my interior lights. So good luck with that. Let's see, spinning the wheel again. Hey, I ended up on the same question I did before. How does that happen? Well, we have William Malloy. I believe there are some repairs that should be done together, like ball joints and hubs. My reasoning is that work together to add stability. And if you only fix one, say the hubs, and the bad ball joints will permanently shorten the life of the new hub. Your thoughts? No. I don't agree with that. If you got one broken part, yes, it can affect another broken part, but a ball joint affecting a hub, which I think you're talking about a wheel bearing issue, I don't see those two things coinciding with each other. However, I'm not saying that replacing those things while you're in there is a bad idea either. Okay, but me, I only want to spend the money on the stuff that's broken and deal with that. If it's a known problem on a vehicle, like you know that this vehicle's gonna have a wheel bearing problem at some point in the future and you're doing the ball joint, hey, why not throw in the wheel bearing while you're at it, because you're kind of almost there. But doing it as a general practice, as a general rule, it's not something I do. I'm more of a fix what's broken kind of guy. But there is such a thing as preventative maintenance. So I'm not saying you're doing it wrong, but I'm saying if you're looking to go about this economically, then maybe that's not the best course of action. Okay. Here we go. Let's see. Clinton Erickson. Hi, Eric. I have a 1995 Saturn SL with 334,000 miles on it. Well done. It has a 1.9 liter single overhead cam motor with a 5-speed manual transmission, and I had a motor and tranny swap from a 1996 Saturn from a salvage yard done at the transmission shop 7 years ago. And after the work was done, my shift indicator light comes on momentarily when I need to shift from first to second and afterwards. It doesn't come back on until I'm in 5th gear at around 53 miles per hour. The motor is at 2,500 RPMs, and the reason why the light would come on when I am in 1st gear and not the rest until I'm in 5th, and the car thinks I have 6-speed when I have 5. Is there a connection I need to check, or possibly a sensor that's not working correctly? Also, for some reason, when I have the key out of the ignition and I open the door, the chime goes off thinking I still have the key in the ignition. Is this an issue with the lock cylinder or ignition switch? Any help would be greatly appreciated. Love your videos. Stay dirty. Okay, you did what you Frankensteined it. Let's put it this way. Well, the transmission shop Frankensteined it. Because they Frankensteined it, and I often tell people this because they're like, hey, I want to put a V6 in place of my 4-cylinder. Well, with modern vehicles, it's not like it used to be. It used to be you could swap engines, carburetors, intakes, all that kind of stuff. Not a problem at all. But with modern vehicles, they're engineered within an inch of their lives. And the powertrain and everything is all interconnected. There's a wiring harness that goes with that engine and transmission, and a computer that goes with that also need to be considered when you're doing these engine swaps, or powertrain swaps in this case, where you got engine and transmission. I'm thinking there's nothing you can do in that instance, because as you said, you've got a 5-speed and it thinks you have a 6-speed, and the computer's probably really confused about what the inputs it's getting from the engine and transmission. It's like, hey, wait a minute, there used to be a 5-speed in here, or used to be a 6-speed, or anyway, the computer's probably trying to figure out what the heck is going on. I don't think the lock cylinder issue is related. Of course, if you've heard the news lately, there's been issues with GM ignition switches. That could be the case. Also, something, in the defense of GM on this, and no, I'm not really defending GM, but something that I've seen a lot that causes ignition switch issues is if you've got a lot of stuff on your key ring. If you've got like a couple pounds of just keys or stuff on your key ring, that can put a strain on the lock cylinder and possibly damage the ignition switch over time. So consider that. If you've got like a really heavy key ring, that can cause issues with your ignition switch over time. So consider that. Another thing to consider is in accidents, one of the first places your knees go is into that set of keys, and that can tear you up pretty good. So if you've got like a bunch of stuff dangling there that your knees can go into in the event of an impact, also consider that. So lighter key rings, that type of thing. I'm not saying that's what caused it in your case. I'm just bringing it up because we're talking about ignition switches. I'm just throwing that in there. But you may have an issue with that ignition switch, and with that, if that being the case, you call up the local Saturn dealer, General Motors dealer, whatever, and you give them your VIN number and ask if it's covered under the extended warranty or whatever it is. And if it is, take it in, have them swap out the ignition switch, and you're good to go. As far as the other issues that you're having there, well, you may have to live with those because, you know, you went from 96 to 95. It's always best on a modern vehicle to put in what came out of it. If you're going to make those kind of severe modifications, you really have to know what you're doing so that you can make sure that everything works like it's supposed to. And that involves, like I said, usually an engine harness and usually a computer and sometimes some reprogramming and sometimes some other stuff. And most times a period of trial and error before everything comes together. But in your case, 7 years, you've been living with it. Maybe take the bulb out of the shift light and ignore that from here on out. All right, moving on. We have Jesse Silva right below that. Hey, Eric, I have a 1999 A4. That's what that is. A4 with 125,000 miles. Excuse me there. I just recently changed my oil, and now my lifters have become a little louder. I usually use Castrol Edge Full Synthetic because that's what VW Audi recommends. But this time I went with Mobil 1 because of what I hear about them. So do you think that has caused my lifters to become louder, or should be preparing for something worse? You didn't list the viscosity. Now going from one brand to another of the same viscosity shouldn't make too much difference. And I've actually talked to oil experts on this. There can be issues between different brands of oils, meaning that the additive package in one type of oil may not react well with the additive package in another type of oil. But that's kind of a stretch in a sense. I mean, what these experts recommended was that you stick with the brand of oil that you're used to using. Now, in your case, the first thing that comes to my mind is, did you use the same viscosity or the correct viscosity? Because not using the correct viscosity could cause something like this. And since those issues came up after you did the oil change, then I would say there's a high probability that the oil change has something to do with the noise that you're experiencing. Either you didn't hear it before, or now that you've used the different lubrication, maybe that's it. Something to note, whenever you change the oil in your engine, there's still at least a quart that's left inside of there, which is a good thing for some people who forget to fill up the crankcase before they send it out. But you usually never get out all of the oil. So there's some mixing that's going to happen in there of those two different types of oils, no matter what. But I would go back and make sure you use the correct viscosity. If you did use the correct viscosity and you're not having this issue, well, I would switch back to the other oil and just see. And just give it a try and see if it goes away. But as far as what the issue actually is, if it will develop into something worse, that's just going to have to be monitored over time. The other thing is the oil filters that you use. If you use like maybe a different type of oil filter or something like that, maybe there was an issue created there. So maybe it's not the oil, maybe it's the filter. It's hard to say. But yeah, that's a tricky one. And I did, like I said, I'll post a link in the description to a video I did where I talked to some oil experts about issues like this. And you can pick apart what they said and decide for yourself what you want to do. All right, here's another one that I thought I might want to get to. This is from Gern Blanston. Greetings, Eric. A few months back, my daughter's 2006 Civic LX 1.8 liter threw a code of a P0497 evap canister low purge flow, and around the same time became difficult to start immediately after filling up the gas tank. The car will only start if the gas pedal is fully depressed, but it runs rough, as though it's rich. for a few seconds thereafter. All subsequent starts are normal until it's time to fill up. After limited online research, it seemed the most probable cause would be a badge purge control valve. So I replaced it, but the problem and code remained. The gas cap was replaced as well with an OEM. For curiosity, with a half tank of gas remaining, I unscrewed the gas cap and replaced it, thinking it might be a pressure issue. But the car started right up. It only happens after a fill up. Any suggestions? And I'm not afraid to get dirty. Good for you. Evap issues are tricky. Many times when you diagnose them, you use a smoke machine. And I've actually seen online people making homemade smoke machines, just throwing that out there. But it's a really good way to check for leaks in these instances, because you run the smoke into the system, and if, say, a solenoid is leaking, or maybe there's a check valve, because if I'm not mistaken, the purge control, the purge control solenoid is one part of the system, but I also think there's a check valve there. And if that check valve is having an issue, which is a mechanical component as opposed to the electronic component, it might set the same code. So there may be something else in the system that's leaking or causing that leak or vapor leak, because I think you're absolutely right, because after a fill up, this canister purge is purging and putting fuel vapor into the engine while you're filling it up. So it's not blocking off that vapor flow to the engine while you're filling up like it should be. So for some reason, that's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So therefore, your engine's basically flooding. If you're having to put your foot to the floor to get it to start, everything you're describing says it's flooded. And after you've done your fill up, those gas fumes are probably going right in the engine and doing exactly that. So there are likely other components in that circuit that you're going to need to find. I'm not too familiar with what exactly those are, but as I said, sometimes there's a check valve in there in addition to the electronic valves, and that may be what's causing the issue. So that's where I would look in that instance. But I think you're right that you are flooding out while you're trying to do that stuff. I got time for maybe a couple more. Hard to say. Chris Rocha. I've seen you at the meetups. Hi, Chris. Hey, Eric. Enjoyed the meetup. Looking forward to next year. Me too. I just got an HID conversion kit from Motor Fiend. Many thanks to you and them for that. My 01 Dodge Ram, for my 01 Dodge Ram. My truck has a quad headlight setup, 2 low beam and 2 high beam. In your opinion, would it make any sense for me to get an additional kit to switch the high beams to HID? If I did, HID, do I stick to the 6K bulbs? I'm planning on upgrading my fog lights to HID down the road as well. Okay, I wouldn't do it, because the regular lights are bright enough, and you don't often use well, at least I don't often use my bright lights that often. But given that, a lot of people have issue with installing HIDs into halogen housings, and for good reason, because of glare to oncoming drivers. You don't want to blind oncoming drivers. I would just stick with the low beams the way they are. As far as the fog light, and go for it. I did the same thing in my Element. Fog lights are down way low, or driving lights, so they don't affect people with glare as much. However, the 6K I might reconsider, because I prefer like the 4500-ish. It's a wider light. The higher you go up in the color temperature, like the 6K, 8K, it gets a lot bluer. It seems to me that there's sort of an adverse effect with glare in inclement weather with those type of lights, and that's why I prefer the wider light of the 4500K-ish kits. So that's what I usually go for. But as far as installing the HIDs and the brights, nah, don't do it. Just leave those regular halogens just the way they are. But your low beams, all right, you'll be able to see a lot better with those. And the fog lights, once you install those also. And be sure you aim everything properly, please, so we don't blind oncoming drivers. Might have time for one more. Here's a good one. We got Chungadelletta. I butchered that one. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so it's not a real name, so I don't feel bad about it. Hey, Eric. Hey, I hate it when stuff moves when I'm looking at it. Hey, Eric, is it true that engines need to be revved up at high RPM from time to time in order to clean carbon deposits? Well, sorta. yeah, it's like clearing your throat. And I'm not saying you need to do it all the time, and it also depends on how you drive. It also depends on the condition of the vehicle. But me, I like to, every once in a while when I'm getting on an on-ramp and a highway, it's like a really good place to do this and make sure everything is clear. But just put the hammer down. Just sort of clear out and just completely open up the engine, run it at full throttle for, you know, a few seconds or whatever, just like I say, to sort of clear its throat. I'm not saying it's going to get rid of carbon. Well, I'm not saying that's going to be the do-all end-all as far as getting rid of carbon deposits, but I do it from time to time. And it's you do see issues with people that don't, you know, sort of baby their vehicles. If they don't run them hard every once in a while, and they're real ginger with the way they drive, then there can be buildup. And also short tripping is another thing. Like if you're only going from point A to point B and the engine never really gets up to temperature, a lot of condensation happens inside the crankcase, and as a result, you get this milkshakey yellowish goo that sometimes lives in there as a result of that. So and it's not a bad idea to run them, use them. I mean, engines were made to be used and sometimes abused. So yeah, take that with a grain of salt. You know, it's something I do. Is it necessary? I enjoy doing it. So we'll leave it at that. But with that, I believe we're out of time for this week. But we will be back in 2 weeks. Remember, October 22nd is the next live show, same bat time at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard. Thank you very much for watching my little program here, and I hope I was able to address some of your questions. As I said, when this is all said and done, be sure to check the description. I work for probably the next half hour or so trying to put all that stuff in there for you so you have it available to you. Remember, not answering the YouTube questions. Sorry about that. Same with Google Plus. Questions asked after the event. Wait for the next show or head over to EricTheCarGuy.com, as I mentioned earlier. Outside of that, I think we're done. But I really did enjoy it. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And we will, as soon as I find the right screen here, we will see you next time. So be safe, have fun, and stay dirty. See you later.